Hello and welcome to the 2018 July 11th meeting of the Node.js modules team. We have 12 participants and a feedback loop going on today. We have an agenda of different items. We're running a little bit behind time, so we may need to shave some time off of some of those items. But in the meantime, let's kick it off. Is there anyone from the group that we have right now who can volunteer to take notes?
I can take notes.
Perfect, thank you. I'm dropping the doc link into the chat. Everyone who's on the call right now, if you could please add your name to the attendance list inside of that doc. This is the only way that we know that you actually showed up, aside from cross-referencing against the video. So this week, we do not have any outstanding pull requests to review as a team. All the pull requests right now are either, don't have consensus within the pull request itself, or alternatively, we're looking at things that are just editorial changes. There's a couple things to just update on progress. We have these set for 3 minutes each, but maybe we can shorten this down to even shorter. First issue is number 135, have a presentation about loaders. Brad, I believe that's yours. Can you quickly just give people an update on what's going on with that?
I'm not entirely sure. I kind of thought we would be doing it during one of these meetings, but these meetings have been kind of jumbled around with summer vacation, so maybe we should schedule it for a different time. The main concern here is we are using a lot of terms and things, and we are not really clearly defining what we're talking about, so things have miscommunications or unknown meanings, and I wanted to fix that for loaders because people seem to be leaning heavily on them, but not talking about what they are. So maybe next week or the week after we can have a presentation, but I don't really want to discuss a lot of what we're discussing about using loaders without at least coming to an understanding across the working group on what they are. So
okay, cool. I'll make a proposal. Maybe next week we take 30 minutes and just focus on loaders in the way that we've been doing for interop. Does that sound reasonable to you?
It's a long. I can try to push it down to 30 minutes, but it's probably 45.
Okay, cool. Let's carve 45 minutes out of next Wednesday to focus on loaders. I think it's a good idea. We should all be talking and thinking about it. So the next one we have is Initiative Terminology Historical Decisions document. Saleh, that was yours, right?
Yeah, so a quick update on this. I'm probably not the best person to put things in words for other people, for other human beings. And honestly, I do, if it's a very important thing, and I think it is, to have terminology, I would like to have some more participation. I honestly tried to do it, and I think people thought it was overkill. To balance things off, I think the initiative itself is something I can keep track with and keep on working on. But the actual definitions and the structure, this has to come from people who actually know the terms well, and people who maybe need certain terms defined, and then it becomes the best person to address a term is able to answer that either in a doc or through the issue. I guess this is really the update, because I feel like it's been stagnant, and every time I try to push, I don't think I get the result I'm hoping for, and on my own, I'm not getting there.
Okay. Is anyone able to volunteer to help Saleh kind of take this over the hump to the next stage? Since we don't have volunteers right now and we need to move forward, Saleh, I'm really busy for the next week or two, but after I kind of 2 weeks from now, I'm more than happy to spend some time. Otherwise, if anyone else from the group can help review that doc and fill things in, that would be helpful.
Definitely 2 weeks for me is good because I'm also very busy those 2 weeks. So that would, okay.
Great. The next one that we have up is the developer survey. This is something that I brought up. We haven't really dug into it. I think it would be really good for us to put together a survey and put it out to developers. One thing I've been thinking about regarding it is like whether or not we should be doing an open survey to the entire community, or whether we should be trying to pull specific stakeholders such as maintainers of Babel or Webpacker. Like, the big thing for me is we make broad statements sometimes, making assumptions about what people or groups or stakeholders want. And I would like to essentially go and, like, if we have assumptions about what stakeholders want, I would love to see some data to prove out that it isn't, you know, just an assumption or an anecdote, but we have some stuff there. Gus, you have your hand up? Gus, if you're talking, you are muted right now. Gus, going once, going twice. Okay, I'm gonna lower your hand there. I'm gonna assume that you don't have something to add right now. Let me know if I'm wrong. But so if anyone wants to pick up running with that, just let me know. Alternatively, you know, on a similar timeline to the other stuff, when I have a little more free time, I'll be digging into that. But maybe this is the kind of thing we could be thinking about when we're framing some of our bigger conversations. When we bring up statements, maybe we can connect them. Okay, cool. So on to the next bit of the agenda. We have some discussion points for today. So we have 4 main items for us to discuss. This was originally slated to take 45 minutes, but we only have 40 minutes. Let's try to stick to the 10-minute time boxes that we have set up, and we may just have only 10 minutes for transparent interrupt, but if we can gain extra time, let's use it. So kicking off, the first one is thinking about deadlines, and maybe this is where we can get back some of that time. I'm just gonna leave it to the floor. Have people been thinking about these deadlines at all? Do you think that some of the deadlines that we're talking about are reasonable? What kind of things can we be shipping, and when should we be thinking about it? Does anyone have any thoughts around this?
I do. I don't think the deadlines, at least the dates we have in that issue, are reasonable given our current pace. And I don't think we are going to achieve that pace, even if we do much more streamlined approaches to things. We're talking about expanding our scope constantly, expanding the communication channels. And every time we do that, it takes time. And I don't think we can get close to those dates. And I think we're getting further away from them instead of closer.
Okay, great. Jordan?
Yeah, I don't like the idea of deadlines here at all. I think the point of this group is not to ship modules quickly. The point of this group is to gain consensus and ship them properly. If the goal was to ship them quickly, then instead of getting 40 people together to talk about things, we would have shipped the decisions that had been made prior to the group. And there's a number of reasons why the modules working group process is a good thing, and I'm glad we're doing it. But speed is not the benefit I see from this. So it's fine. I think it's fine if we want to, I think we should be prioritizing aggressively the order in which we do things. I don't think we should be thinking about implementations in any way whatsoever until we've agreed on what an implementation should be, for example. And I think we should be aggressively pushing to decide, like we all need to decide as quickly as we can what the first implementation should be. That we made, I think that it's important that we do that, so that if we decide that we want to sacrifice constraints or use cases because of UX reasons or implementability reasons, then that's a discussion we need to be able to have. But first, we need to have decided what, in an ideal world, we would want those constraints to be and the implementation to look like. And so I think basically just any discussion of deadlines is very premature, as is any discussion of implementations or specific shapes of solutions, because we don't even know what we're doing yet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jan?
Yeah, so one thing I would add is premature. Sorry. I agree that talking about very specific dates might be premature. What I would say is that being able to say something about our timeline, given existing ecosystem expectations, would be good. Like even if our official position is we don't believe that we can commit to any Node version shipping political support, then we should say that very openly, very publicly, very loudly. Because so far, that's not what the ecosystem heard. And the second thing I would say, and that is kind of reinforcing what you just said, even if we can't commit to dates, I think we can come up with an order of things. Like what are our milestones? What do we want to achieve? So that we know that when we have a discussion, we know where we are heading. Because I think, at least from my impression, a lot of our discussions so far have been around just exploring the space, which is great. But if we don't know what the outcome of that discussion is or what our first deliverable is, then I don't think that these discussions have the value that they could have.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Saleh?
I think what I'm realizing, the more I dig into using loaders and using experimental modules with Node, I realize that the standard is very web biased, and there are, and this is actually the thing I think that we need to be talking about. The fact that we're trying to make loaders work and follow the standards, and the experimental module loading works out of the box and follows the standard and meet all the expectations of everyone about how JavaScript has to follow the standards. I think the bigger problem right now comes from the fact that we are trying to fit something in the wrong hole. I think the standard, which gets revised every year, should recognize the very common trends that distinguish a browser from something like Node. And if it is part of a standard, then we can conform and we can problem solve to meet things that are part of the standard. Something like specifiers. These are all problems that we can try to solve and we can put deadlines to solve. But at the end of the day, the solution will have to be biased against someone out there in the community. And we're going to end up creating more problems, and time creep will just not end, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Saleh. Guy? Guy, do you have anything to add? I'm going to assume no. Geoffrey, you have your hand up? Oh, yes, I can hear you.
Sure, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say I agree with saying that, we do have to be goal-oriented here and thinking in terms of what the deliverables are. And it would help, I think, that we have some public information about what our status is at any given time. So what we see the deliverables are, how we break that down, and then just noting what the statuses are of those. So for example, the base level implementation unflagged, what's the status of that? Is it stable? Because there's people already asking, can we use MJS? Let's all get behind that. And without more information available publicly from this group saying what the status of that base level implementation is, people are just assuming, oh, the base level implementation is just going to be MJS and no other features like what we have. So we need to make it clear what the status of experimental modules is, and then split out and say there will be a separate deliverable phase for loaders. So it could possibly initially land without loaders, and then loaders could be added. split it out into the individual deliverables with their associated status.
Excellent. A 2.5 minute warning so everyone knows. Geoffrey, you're up.
I was just going to add, just building off of that, before I joined the group, the fact that experimental modules was shipping in core and is like in the docs on the webpage led me to assume that it was just like imminent, that this was like a beta period, that this was what modules was going to be. I know there's not much appetite in the group for like removing it from core, but if there's some way to better communicate to the public that this isn't quite imminent, this is not set in stone, I think that's something we should aim for.
Does the flag being called experimental not achieve that?
I didn't assume that. I mean, there are lots of things that are under Harmony. Like every experience I've ever had with things that were flagged in Node has always been, they ended up working exactly as I started using them under flags.
Every single thing under Harmony should never have been used in production. Like async await had a massive memory leak while it was under the Harmony flag. So like, I don't know, we should educate to fix that, but like anything that's under a flag is like absolutely a terrible idea to use in production. It is unstable. It is likely to change. It could go away completely. And anyone who, if someone doesn't have that impression, then like we should figure out how to.
I mean,
educate
hey, I'm all the way onto this group and I haven't had that impression. So I'm not saying I'm right, but we need to increase the education somehow then.
Yeah. So Brad, we have 1 minute left.
Yeah, I just want to like compound something that I'm starting to feel here. We're talking about going and creating these minimal implementations and stuff. We're starting to see more PRs and things. And every time we create these PRs before we discuss like the feature set of a minimal implementation, we have to go back and kind of dig out all the reasoning why a PR should be designed a specific way. And I think that's going to expand our time. So although we should notify people of statuses, the more PRs we create, the more different proposals that we create full implementations of, the more we're going to have to like dig back to our use cases from them. And the more we're going to have to investigate the implications of shipping those. And the more statuses we're going to have to ship on whatever information, web page, whatever, to say, hey, this proposal has these problems. This proposal doesn't. This proposal serves these use cases. This proposal doesn't. This proposal is in favor. This proposal isn't. And we need to be very careful about saying we should create these minimal implementations. And that's what I was saying when I said we are getting our deadlines further pushed out right now. Like we are creating more work. Okay.
Cool. So we're going to wrap up that topic for now. Just, I guess, one thing to add, just myself as the person who had created the issue. The purpose of bringing up those deadlines and timelines was not so that we could set explicit timelines that we need to meet. It was not about trying to rush things. It was more about trying to show how like October as a deadline would still not have us shipping unflagged in all nodes until 2020. So just kind of understanding the amount of time that it takes to roll out. So we have a mental model of that. The next thing that we have up, and we could choose how much time we want to spend on these next two. The first one is the pull request that's open for import meta require. We've been going kind of back and forth on this. Import meta require is a pull request that I opened as an alternate mechanism for doing interoperability. I know a lot of people have a lot of different feelings on it. And since this is my PR, I may interject in between people having their hands raised. I'll try to like physically raise my hand and respect the order that people were in, but I'm gonna have to chime in on this one. I'll start by leaving it to the floor. Does anyone have any particular thoughts about this? Brad? Brad, if you're talking right now, you are muted.
I think it is premature to land the PR. I have like an entire other thread about why we shouldn't ship import meta.require. We should do something that early errors. I also have like web compatibility concerns, loader ambiguity concerns, and all these things. And I really haven't seen those addressed anywhere. So maybe once we get there, we can talk about it. But we also have a moratorium on new features. So like we aren't really modifying core. And we've even had people in this meeting suggest maybe they want to remove core's implementation. So
Brett, I think the purpose of the time right now is actually to discuss this. Like, do you have particular concerns around import meta require that you'd like to discuss during this meeting?
Sure. We can bring them up. First, let's talk about loader ambiguity. Loader ambiguity is basically, can a loader determine the format of a given file? If the consumer determines the format, that means using require, I get a different format from using import for the same given resource. That means the loader can't actually know this information ahead of time. It has to do it A, at runtime, and B, it is unsafe to make assumptions about the resource always being loaded in the same fashion. So that means things like singleton modules could actually be loaded in two different execution contexts. So you get two instances instead of a singleton, which is what things like Winston or other logging libraries often do. They're a single instance. They break
clarity, a quick clarifying question on that. Are you talking about two instances as in we could have one in the common JS graph and one in the ESM graph?
Graph doesn't really make sense to me. Yes, you could have two different instances.
Okay, and the current implementation where we're using import inside of ESM for any dependency loading, including dynamic import, relieves that because it checks the ESM cache before falling back to the require cache?
No, it just makes it unambiguous. So you still only get one instance. It doesn't check a given cache first. It just knows, hey, this is the authority for the file because this is the format of the file. Mm-hmm. So there's no real complexity there, and you can do it ahead of time still. You lose this ahead of time capability, and you make it so files don't necessarily have known formats, which is a problem if you've got a loader and you don't know what you're doing. So something like, let's say, I've got up Babel, and it takes common JS and converts it to ESM, whatever that means. This would have difficulty with up Babel because it would always see import as text JavaScript, or I should say as ESM, and not as CJS. So it kind of has to guess, oh, was this meant to be common JS? Was it not? And it has to like re-implement all these things, and every tool has to re-implement this. It's ambiguous, and it becomes a convention. It uses heuristics. Those heuristics can be problematic. So
quick question on that. Is that only the case when we have a combination of import meta require and transparent interop?
No, it is by the nature of, actually transparent interop kind of relieves that a bit. The problem is that you don't actually synchronize your two module systems, and so they go out of sync, and you get these ambiguities. You get these double instantiations and things. So the claim of import meta require is that it makes things simpler, but it makes things weirder and more ambiguous, actually. It's a nicer API. It's a more familiar API if you really like require, but it's also going to lead to these weird things happening.
Okay, well, Saleh, you've had your hand up for a little while. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, like I was actually thinking about import meta require, and I guess Brad just mentioned that he wants something to throw earlier. I was thinking of a meta property import.resolve, which would actually might not just be a Node thing. You know, I was thinking of it in a general sense. And if we have an import.resolve and you can't resolve in the browser or you can't resolve in Node, then you don't even require something like import.meta.require at that point, because you're just going to dynamically import if you resolve, and that will be agnostic to if you're in Node or you're in a browser. Of course, when I say that, I'm just saying this is an imaginary meta property. And I just want to, see if other people might think that this kind of alleviates the concerns. Because if you can't resolve something, regardless of the platform, you're not going to further require it using something like import meta require. I honestly think that import meta require is not something I would encourage. I think dynamic imports that actually give you the CJS module is sufficient from my perspective. I don't know. This is my feedback from my testing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. Jan?
I had a clarifying question to what to return namespace to an exports object. Sorry. All right. I had a clarifying question to what Bradley was saying about the duplicate singletons. So, can you describe? So, using import method, is it because a file might be passed as either, and if you import it and you require it, you load it once as ESM and once as CommonJS, or where does the duplicate singleton come from?
So that's one possibility. The other possibility is we ship these dual builds. So if you've been watching the interop patterns issue, the idea that you ship a package that is able to be loaded both as CommonJS and as ESM, that's one way you get this double kind of scenario where you have Babel take ESM, compile it to CJS, and ideally, in whatever node version, you only ever load one of those two. You either load the ESM because ESM is supported, or you only load the CommonJS because ESM is not supported. So like there's a migration problem here. Import meta require doesn't really address it. And so if we add it later, it's a problem for import meta require. So it's a future facing concern. It's a grammar ambiguity concern. Like there's a variety of things going on.
But isn't that a just general problem with any kind of project that uses require in any kind of form and import in any kind of form? If we have these duplicate, like if for example, this logging library that has a singleton export, if it ships with the ES6 ES module source code and compiled CommonJS code, if I have one file that is still a CommonJS module, import that singleton, and another file that is written as ES6, import the uncompiled singleton, I will have two copies of the singleton in the app one way or another. Like import meta require doesn't seem to change the equation.
So import.meta require does change the equation because if you declare, hey, this is Winston, you should only load Winston, just npm install Winston. You're only going to get one of those versions. If you have these dual package things, how would you get a hold of the CommonJS version versus the ESM version?
I mean, so for example, I have an application where multiple files are importing Winston, or reloading Winston. I have one part of my app, which is my controllers. They are still in CommonJS, and I have my routing file, which is a ES6 module. So in the ES6 module, I use import to use Winston. Winston has an index set to index, just index, and it has an index.mjs and an index.js that are siblings. So now in my route file, in my route file, I would load index.mjs, get one singleton, and then in my controllers, which are CommonJS modules and I just have access to require, I would then randomly load the other singleton because I would be loading index.js. Isn't that correct?
That is not actually part of this conversation, but that is not necessarily true. There are multiple designs we could take here. The best migration path is where they both get MJS if ES modules are supported. Like you get a promise back from require, there's like forwards compatibility, and there's like this whole thread about migration and interop patterns that we don't get if we can't support that. Namely, like consumer and author migration are taken into account when we're migrating. The consumers can migrate separately from the authors of packages, and we are kind of sacrificing that with import meta require under the idea that we won't have transparent interop.
So time check on here. We do need to move on to the next topic. Thank you, everyone, for bringing that up. And Brad, I'm going to take a hard think on some of these edge cases that you brought up. They're really valid, and I have to, I'll think about it quite a bit. The next thing that we have coming up is issue number 51 about package name maps, which is a browser proposal for supporting their imports in the browser. We have a 10-minute time box on this, but I may end us early depending on how much people begin so that we can have at least 10 minutes for discussing transparent interop. I started the timer here. Does anyone have anything to start here in talking about package name maps? Questions, concerns, thoughts? Brad?
I have opinions on everything pretty much, but package name maps, I think no matter what we do, we're never going to achieve 100% web compatibility in the way we're evolving right now. And I think forcing us into package name maps gives us a master-slave relationship to WhatWG that I am very uncomfortable with. WhatWG is very biased towards browsers. It's been a little bit uncomfortable even discussing things with them because I'm not a browser vendor, and that has been brought up to me. Mm-hmm. And Node is not a browser vendor, so it most likely is in the same boat. I don't think package name maps are something we should be beholden to, and I am not even sure they're a good idea for the web. And that's a longer discussion, but the overall thing is matching the web is good, but we don't have to do it through package name maps.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Jordan?
Yeah, so I have not dove as deeply as Bradley, so I don't have technical responses to package name maps specifically, but I like the idea of a way to make bare imports work in a browser without an additional build step. I like the idea of NPM automatically creating this resource for some sort of default path. For almost every web server setup, you're not going to want to use that anyway because you don't want all of your node modules to be exposed to the public. So but like, so in general, I like that as a clean path for not having to mutate, not having to change import paths in order to ship stuff in the browser. I don't think that it would work well for Node to rely by default on a static package name map. I think it should always be possible to create a package name map for any snapshot of a file system that works, but I don't think, I think that the directory searching and extension resolution and stuff like that is incredibly critical, and so that kind of blocks out being able to use any sort of static format as the default implementation. Mm-hmm. So that's the only place I have a personal concern about it.
Okay, Guy.
I just wanted to clarify. When we're thinking about package name maps, I think aiming for compatibility, not necessarily as Bradley's worried about, making them first class necessarily, but ensuring there's compatibility. So if I've got a module working in Node, I've got a file that's an ES module, that it's possible to use a package name map to make that run in the browser. And the main limitation you do with maps that you can do in Node is when you're loading either a URL or a relative URL, not a plain name as defined in the WhatWG, you end up automatically add file extensions. So you can map a plain name, the name of things we can check file system and extension. Just let me know if I'm breaking out. But it's the relative imports that we need to then ensure have the file extensions present. We do get compatibility if people just do that as a pattern, but mandating the removal of automatically adding extensions is certainly an interesting thing to consider there. So I think that's a very interesting consideration.
Okay, thank you. Kevin?
Yeah, I was just going to say package.json for managing, dependencies and whatnot works pretty well. And we want to be mindful to not start trying to fix things that aren't broken.
Hey, can you expand on what you mean by not fixing things that aren't broken, Kevin?
Yeah, so like the others have mentioned, the nodes resolution mechanism, its integration with npm to install dependencies in all the right places and that kind of thing. It works. In my mind, there's no need to go and to rewrite that, because there happens to be a proposal for package name maps, that seems to do some of the same things. Does that make sense?
Yes. Geoffrey?
Hey, I was just gonna say, like, I feel like the whole reason we're doing this is to try to standardize with the web. That, like, if we wanted to have a separate or incompatible module system, we already have CommonJS. And I understand the frustration with working with WhatWG and so on, that we're beholden to them and all the rest. But still, like, I think, certainly one of our top goals is to be like, we should be able to, users should be able to write code that works the same way in both environments. Like, I can't put an import statement inside an if. I can't put like if document import blah 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 else import blah 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 to account for like the package name resolution being via package name maps on a browser or via like the require algorithm in Node. Like, there's a lot of value in giving users a way to make it identical, or for that this should behave the same way in both places, even if the spec doesn't necessarily require it, even if that means we can't do other things that we like, such as, automatic file extensions, et cetera, et cetera. So I would just like us to try to keep that in mind.
Thank you. Brad, and just so you know, I want to maybe wrap up in about 2 minutes.
Okay, so I just want to make a counterpoint to people stating we can't have our cake and eat it too, kind of. The node resolution algorithm has advantages. We even saw some stuff about having to manually patch an Angular app in the minimal ESM PR. I really think we shouldn't be forced into the idea that we have to match the web when we are already using tools, when tools are required for these package name maps anyway, that we can't use these tools to assist us with package name maps. Package name maps can support complex directory file extension resolving for bare imports already, because you can put a URL in your package name map that is a directory, and it can point to index.json or index.js. You can put a URL in these package name maps that is to an index file, and it can point to index.json. It can point to index.js. And under all of this idea, you need a tool to use package name maps anyway. And so there is some strange corresponding behavior I'm missing, where we're arguing for a technology that requires a tool, but we're arguing against tools. And I would really like people to think about that and maybe come back to me and tell me how that's not a problem.
So 2 things. We have a bunch of hands up. We have 10 minutes left on the meeting. Do we want to keep going down this path, or do we want to talk about transparent interop today?
I'd like to just respond to what Bradley said.
Okay, let's just keep going on this topic and push transparent interop until the next meeting. One thing I do want to say to you, Brad, though, is there's a difference between install time tooling, build tooling, and production tooling. And the only tooling that's required for package name maps is install tooling. And
I completely disagree. Like, that is a very long conversation, but it is not sufficient. And I have like a 50-page thing in package community's old GitHub repo that got archived.
Yeah, we should talk about it. I'm glad we have a meeting right after this. Jordan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I think Bradley largely covers my feelings here, but I mean, to Geoffrey's point, like, web compatibility is a huge goal, but that's not why we're adding modules to Node. We're adding modules to Node because they're part of the language. And if we want to be Node.js, we have to support JS, like the language. So even if there was no way to become compatible with the web, Node should still ship ESM, like full stop. Web compatibility is super important, and I really hope we maximize what that means. But also, web compatibility doesn't mean we do what browsers decide, nor does it mean we do what browsers tell us to do. It means we, try and maximize how you can write code that works in both places. And that might mean no build process, but that might require a build process. And that might not be ideal, but that would still be a place where we would ship something in Node.
Geoffrey?
I was just going to say that, when I read the package name maps proposal, if you look at the example there, it's only like a short JSON file. Like a lot of packages are, going to want to only have one entry point. Like jQuery is just one file. You could throw that into a folder, throw this package name map JSON file around it and have it point to jQuery.js, and you're done. You didn't need a build tool to create that. There's going to be a lot of front end tools that are along those lines that don't require tooling. So I think that the idea that people are going to need to sure, jQuery, it uses a build tool, of course, but there are simple libraries that don't necessarily require or use build tools. But the idea that since this is going to force you to use a build tool, then the build tool can solve any and all compatibility problems, I think is overstating things. Just as you can hand create a package.json, you can hand create this package name map file.
Thank you very much. Saleh?
I think package name maps, I haven't really looked at the details of it, but the thing I've been using, or I used to use very frequently, was path mapping in TypeScript. I know that TypeScript has to build anyways, but it was, from my experience, it was simply relating a name to a particular path, and then anything you slash out of there is basically resolved relative to that path. I don't know if I'm missing the point, of package name maps, if they're not as simple as this in implementation. But that kind of implementation, it definitely helps resolve incompatibilities with bare specifiers in a module intended for Node, if you want to load it in a browser. I think we should look, we should all try to get more familiar with what package name maps bring, or the challenges that it could bring. I think it shouldn't be just that we think it's good or bad. No, we actually have to talk more in detail about this. I think the discussion has been long enough. So I'm up for definitely talking more about this, and maybe having a dedicated issue that we can discuss this further. That's my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Got 4 minutes left. Some of the things that I would bring up from my thought process is, I think when we're thinking about the resolution algorithm for CommonJS versus ESM, I think it's important for us to think about what kind of user experience we want to have in ESM, and not assume that we need to match the behavior of CommonJS and things that we've done. We should be trying to design something that is forward thinking, and that can be the CommonJS patterns, or it may be new patterns. And when we're talking about package name maps, we don't need to necessarily support name maps directly, but I do feel strongly that we should be supporting the resolution algorithm capabilities of name maps, because that will be the only way that we can share source text in between platforms. When we're talking about the browsers, there's a lot of rhetoric that I'm hearing, and I'm not saying that this is without reason, that's framing the browser as a leader who is not listening, and as us as followers. And I think that we need to shift that narrative to try to work with browser vendors which I know has not always been the easiest in the past, but I genuinely believe that there is an opportunity for us to collaborate here. Package name maps in the first place, introducing their imports to the browser, is the browser aligning more towards Node. So we have opportunities here, I genuinely believe, to influence and participate in these decisions. And I think the only way that we really can influence them is by engaging, participating, and adopting these things within our own platform to help align them. Jan, you have your hand up?
Sorry, finished writing. Yeah, the thing I wanted to say is towards Bradley's counterpoint. Yes, we definitely shouldn't feel beholden to what the browser is doing. And yes, for a lot of cases, there is tooling required, like package name maps. There is some implicit, even though there is a possibility to write them by hand, is something implied about them requiring a tool. The thing is that having a simpler resolution algorithm is a feature in itself. Like, we have an opportunity to simplify the resolution algorithm. And I think that is something that we shouldn't just throw away. Because, so for example, we have an open discussion somewhere about adding import.meta.resolve. The reason why we need import.meta.resolve, at least to some degree, is because we made the choice of having all kinds of magic in the resolution algorithm. We cannot just use new URL, which you can do in the browser, for resolving the path to a neighboring file, because it's not as easy anymore. And so I think treating it as a giving up fancier algorithms is not necessarily the whole story. And towards the tooling point, we are also breaking a bunch of tooling, at least in the browser case, beyond just, hey, you need a tool to generate a package name map. So for example, I think one of the reasons why Miles's point towards install tooling and runtime tooling and bundle tooling and production tooling is different is that, for example, install tooling will not modify the files on disk. If you have a Chrome workspace and you mount in your Node modules directory, in theory, it can work, and you can actually use live edit features in Chrome DevTools, or actually get coverage for the files on disk using Chrome DevTools if the files aren't modified. If the files, as soon as the files go to any sort of compilation where path gets changed and the file on disk doesn't match anymore what is actually running in the browser, you either break tooling or you need to layer more and more tooling on top of each other, which is possible, but it also means more and more pieces that can break and more complexity.
Thank you, Jan. We've reached our time. Brad and Guy have their hands up. Brad and Guy, can you both kind of stick to what you're doing in 1 or 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Brad, go for it.
I just want to state, us having a simpler resolution algorithm is not actually what package name maps are aiming for with their resolution. They do have a mapping system here. So we can even include all these like directory searching. We can include like all this ahead of time with our build tools. And we already are having those problems like you're speaking of, Jan, even without package name maps. If you use a redirect in a browser, import meta URL sometimes is really wrong. And we have an issue in the modules repo about it. And the WhatWG has said they will not change it. So I recommend you don't use import meta URL in the browser if there's any possibility of any redirects. And I would like import meta resolve, but even if we include it, it may be simpler in a sense, but it may have the exact same capabilities as what we have right now. So be careful.
Thank you, Brad. Guy?
I just wanted to the pull request you have from number 2172 file extension resolving for ESM. Is there somewhere we can get a poll on that and what people think in terms of how that enables package map compatibility? Is it worth, I mean, how can we get, is that something that we should be looking to get a vote on yet from the modules group or add it to the agenda? What do you think the next are?
Yeah, and you know what, I can guess, sorry, Guy, I can use this as kind of a tipping point for something to think about as we log off today. We really, as a group, need, like, we've been talking through a lot of things and we continue to have a lot of conversations, and I appreciate how thorough everyone is in thinking about things. But Guy, to your question about like, how do we move forward on something? The reality is, the way that we have it set up right now is we need to reach consensus as a group. If we can't reach consensus as a group, we can, in theory, go to a vote. But there is a challenge here. As a group, as a modules team, we are eventually going to want to become chartered. If we want to become chartered, which means that we actually own these things within the project, I personally am not confident that we will be chartered by the TSC if we as a group cannot reach consensus on items. And so I think that it would be possible if people wanted to approach things that way, to essentially, you know, float things to the working group that have blocks, try to, you know, force a vote, and then go to the TSC if we can't reach consensus here. But I don't think that's the way that anyone wants to do things. We want to try to reach consensus. But there will come a point, and this ties back to what we started with today's meeting on about timelines. If it doesn't seem like this group and all the work that we're doing is able to reach consensus, or actually has a future where consensus is possible, you know, what do we do with that? And I don't have an answer for that. I am hopeful that we are able to talk through things and find consensus, but I do think that is something for everyone in the group to think about, because if as a group we are never able to reach consensus, we will be unlikely to be chartered, and we will just kind of go back to what the status quo was before we spun this group up. I guess, you know, that was a pretty heavy thing to add right before we log off. Is there anything anyone wants to add to that really quickly before we call it?
There's hope. We're here. We're working on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that wasn't meant to be super negative. It was an inverse pep talk, I guess. But with that being said, we are 5 minutes over the time that we had allotted. Thank you all for staying late and for finding the time today. See you all next week.